In this video, we're going to be looking at how equilibrium prices and quantities change when exogenous variables cause our demand and our supply curves to shift. We'll also be going through an example from textbook chapter 4, Facts and Tools number 15. So what we're going to be looking at here is we're going to establish, we already know that our equilibrium occurs where our quantity supplied is equal to our quantity demanded. So we also know from previous videos that exogenous variables outside of price and quantity can also cause our demand and supply curves to actually shift. So we're going to look at the mechanics of these shifts and how it affects our equilibrium prices and quantities. So I've went ahead and I've drawn out our basic supply and demand graph with its appropriate labels and labeled them equilibrium 1 for price 1 and quantity 1 in our initial equilibrium, supply 1 for our first supply curve, and demand 1 for our first demand curve. Let's look at this scenario where we're going to shift both our demand and our supply curves. Let's walk through this scenario. Remember that factors that shift our demand curve include income, population, price of substitutes, price of complements, expectations about future supply, and fads and tastes. So first, let's assume that we have an increase in demand. So let's say due to a raise that we got at our job, we have an increase in demand. Well, this increase in demand is going to cause our demand curve to shift to the right. We'll call this D2. This new shift is going to give us a new equilibrium price and quantity that is further up along our quantity supplied curve and increased on our demand curve. So this shift is going to lead us, we'll label this E2. And this will be price 2 and quantity 2. So as a result of this increase in demand, we have higher prices and higher quantities. Now, the way that we would say this is we would say that our demand increased because our curve actually shifted, but our supply, our quantity supplied increased. Remember that when we're moving along a curve, it's a change in quantity supplied versus when we're actually shifting that curve, as we call a shift in demand. So now let's assume that we're going to also see an increase in supply. Remember factors that can influence our increase in supply, technological innovations, which will lead to lower input prices. We have taxes and subsidies. We have entry and exits of new producers. We have changes in opportunity cost, and we have expectations of future prices. So let's say we have one of these changes occur in our exogenous variables and our supply curve increases. This will cause a rightward shift in our supply curve. Now, something to note as we move through this here is that we're no longer looking at our original curves. Our equilibrium is actually going to move as we shift these curves. So after we've shifted both our supply and our demand curve, we've wound up at this new equilibrium point, E3. Now, I'm going to drop this down and tell us that for sure, I'll call this quantity 3. For sure, we know that if demand increases and supply increases, we know that we have an increase in our quantity. However, we do not actually know how much our price changes, And this is because we don't know the extent of these shifts. So we could have a large change in demand and a small change in supply. We could have slight changes in each. We could have large changes in each. Because we don't know how much this curve has shifted, we cannot tell what happened to price. So our price is indeterminate. This is our first example. We're going to walk through 3 more cases so that you can understand the mechanics of this and see how these factors are going to influence our change in equilibrium. So our next situation is an increase in demand and a decrease in supply. And we want to know what happens to our combined effect of equilibrium, price, and quantity. Let's start fresh with our graph here. Get used to drawing these graphs because we will be drawing them all semester. Once again, we have price on our vertical, quantity on our horizontal. We have a downward sloping demand curve called D1. We have an upward sloping supply curve called S1. And now let's just label the equilibrium points so that we can simplify this graph a little bit. So this will give us our initial market equilibrium, E1. So we're going to follow the same process as we did before and look at these shifts one by one. So first we're told that we have an increase in demand. Well, that increase in demand is going to shift our demand curve out and to the right. And give us a new equilibrium point, E2. Again, just as the last time we shifted that demand curve, we end up with a higher price and a higher quantity. So next, we're going to decrease our supply curve. Now, I'm going to make this a little bit more drastic in my shifts to illustrate an example of why our combined effect will always leave one of our factors, either price or quantity, unknown. So let's say now that we see a large decrease in supply, S2. Now we have an equilibrium point where our quantity, where our price is at a higher point than it was at E2, and where our quantity, we're actually not sure. So we label equilibrium 3. So now what we want to compare is we want to compare equilibrium 3 to equilibrium 1, which will give us our combined effect. Now we can definitely say, yes, we know that we have an increase in price. So price is going to increase. Now, in this example, it looks like we have a decrease in quantity. But rather than drawing this shift this way, let's take a look at what happens if I draw my shift equally. So let's take this out. And instead of making such a drastic change, let's make it a little smaller. S2. So now, instead of equilibrium point being here, we have an equilibrium point that's stacked directly on top of our other one, E3, sorry. Directly on top of equilibrium 1. Again, we can't really tell where this is going to fall on our quantity. So because we do not know the extent of the shift, we cannot determine what happens to our quantity. We'll walk through the other 2 examples, and I want to make sure we spend adequate time on each one of these. You'll see problems like these in both your problem set 1 as well as in your chapter 4 homework from the textbook. Let's go through some other scenarios. Now let's look what happens if we see a decrease in demand and an increase in supply. D1, S1, E1. Following this through, first step is to decrease our demand. We know that a decrease in demand is a leftward shift of our demand curve. So we draw that down and we find our new equilibrium point where our new demand curve is equal to our original supply curve. Label this E2. Now we know for a fact that moving from E1 to E2 represents a decrease in demand and a decrease in quantity supplied. Again, we have a shift of our demand curve and a movement along our supply curve, which brings us to a lower price and quantity pair. Next, we're going to increase our supply, again, meaning that one of our exogenous variables outside of our model has changed, causing an increase in supply, which is a rightward shift of our supply curve. And we'll label this point E3. E3 exists where our new demand curve and our new supply curve intersect. Now, the last step here is we compare our original equilibrium, equilibrium 1, to equilibrium 3. Again, it's very obvious that we see a decrease in price. So prices certainly have gone down. But again, because we don't know how much this curve shifted, we can't be sure what happened with our quantity. So our change in quantity of the combined effect of these shifts is going to be unknown. And anytime you see both of these curves shift at the same time, we are not going to be able to determine either the price or the quantity. We'll only be able to determine one of those, and this just depends on which directions these curves go. Again, we could see a large shift in our demand and supply. We could see a short shift. In this example, it looks like we've had equal shifts of our curves, but we don't necessarily know that that is the case. So that is the reason why we're unsure of the quantity that we're going to reach in equilibrium. Let's look at the last scenario here. And hopefully by now this is starting to make some sense here. You'll get some nice practice with this in your problem set, where we will use all of the information that we've learned in the previous videos about shifting our supply and demand curves and bringing all this information together on the same graph. Once again, downward sloping demand curve, upward sloping supply curve, equilibrium 1. We have a decrease in demand, and now we're looking at a decrease in supply as well. We have a decrease in demand leading to a leftward shift of our demand curve, D2, giving us a new equilibrium point, E2, which has, anytime we shift just one curve, we'll be able to know exactly what happens to price or quantity. It's only when we shift the second curve that we introduce some uncertainty. So this first shift from E1 to E2 gives us a lower price point and a lower quantity point. And now we're also going to decrease that supply curve. So a leftward shift of our supply curve, S2, and equilibrium 3 right here. Again, I've drawn these curves pretty equally. So in this scenario, again, we compare equilibrium 1 to equilibrium 3. And it is very obvious right from the start that we certainly have a decrease in our quantity. So quantity has gone down. However, and in case you're figuring out by now, this is kind of the key takeaway from this, the combined effect is going to be unknown in terms of price. Again, these shifts could have been very large, leading to an increase in price. They could have been small, leading to a decrease in price. Because we don't know the extent of the shift and the extent of how much these have changed, we do not know what happened to our price. When you work through these examples in your homework and in your problem set, you will work through not only drawing the shifts here, you will tell me and you will explain to me why our combined effect is unknown. Again, we have no idea how much these curves have shifted. So our combined effect, our total combined effect is going to be unknown. So you will end up drawing these shifts for me. In the problem set, you'll be asked to give reasons why these curves shift. So again, this is going to be something that we will continue throughout the course of the semester, working with these supply and demand shifters. And this is example Facts and Tools number 15 from chapter 4. Thank you for watching.